This week, we're zeroing in on what is easily the most significant story that's swept the world and is upending international relations and the delicate power balances through Europe. It is, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. And so we've assembled a vastly experienced panel of thinkers on global affairs. Joining us today, International and Security Affairs Director at the Australia Institute, Allan Behm. The ABC's former Moscow correspondent Norman Hamont will be joining us from Melbourne, and visiting fellow at the ANU's Centre for European Studies, Kyle Wilson. All three will be with us in just a moment. Now, no one could possibly say, of course, that they were caught unaware by any of this week's events. The build-up was live, televised, sustained and emotive every step of the way until on Thursday afternoon, Australian time, Vladimir Putin pulled the formidable Russian military trigger that he commands.
After days on a razor's edge, Ukraine is now a nation at war.
Russia's military invasion of Ukraine is underway.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
The UN Security Council held an emergency late-night meeting.
The Russian president declared a war on the record. Should I play the video of your president?
We are ready for any outcome.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell.
Circumstances require firm and immediate action from us.
With Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordering troops into the country's Donbass region for what he's called a special military operation.
Ukraine's foreign minister calls it a full-scale invasion and says the time for the world to act is now.
Russian forces, they are ready.
It is coercion, it is bullying by an authoritarian power against a democratic neighbour.
Multiple attacks on cities right across the country.
We heard the sound of explosions here in Kiev. First of all, 3 large, distinct explosions in the distance.
This has all happened under the cover of darkness in Ukraine.
The daylight is finally breaking over Maidan Square, and I think a lot of Ukrainians, if they weren't awake already, they are now, because we've heard more explosions.
Traffic on the streets, people are waking up to what is a full-scale invasion of their country.
Good evening, Ukraine. Tonight, bracing for what the coming hours might bring.
The citizens who'd long prayed for peace now had to face war.
Lines of cars head for Poland, Romania and Moldova. Train stations are swamped.
Residents have listened to calls from their president to take up arms.
We are fighting for our life, we are fighting for our freedom.
Russian fighter jets are spearheading the assault with airstrikes in border regions.
So strikes have continued in Ukraine's key cities overnight.
The country is being attacked from all directions.
Russia should step back. It should unconditionally withdraw.
An attack on Ukraine is an attack on the sovereignty of every UN member state.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Anyone who tries to stop us and threaten our country and people should know Russia's response will be immediate and lead to consequences you have never faced in your history.
Russian police have detained hundreds of people as they chanted no to war.
Muscovites marched outside the city's cultural heart.
Ukrainian Americans have gathered here outside the White House, urging Western leaders to go further.
One of the many protest marches that have been going on from all walks of life, from different nationalities, and standing here in solidarity.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. This conflict must stop now.
Yeah, by any assessment, a historic week craftily reconstructed by our video editor, Nick Vivers, there for afternoon briefing or Friday briefing this week. So just reintroducing the members of our panel, deep thinkers all on international affairs. Allan Behm from the Australia Institute is here in our Parliament House studio in Canberra. Norman Hammond, former ABC Moscow correspondent, and Kyle Wilson with the ANU. Thanks all for answering our call for some analysis. Allan, let's start with you. A general observation first. It's not really a question. No surprises. We saw this coming. What next? As far as we don't want to be measuring conflicts on, bloodshed alone, but this has a long way to run, I assume.
This has a long way to run, and a long time for it to run in. At the moment, a lot of it is unclear. Putin's longer-term intentions are not clear at the moment. What he expects for Ukraine itself. His intentions.
He says no occupation. What does that mean, do you think?
Let's find out. That's one of the problems. We don't know what any of those words mean. He said no invasion as well. We're not quite sure whether he would call what he's done an invasion, but certainly the Western allies all call it an invasion. So we're dealing here with a muddiness. You call it the fog of war, and it always is foggy. This has a long way to run. It's very, very complicated. The dimensions of it regionally, I think, and Kyle and Norman will talk about that, but the global implications for the US and for the US allies, I think, are very profound.
Yeah, that's the big strategic stuff, which we will get to in just a moment, because it underpins the world's attention to all of this. Norm, a fog of war, trying to get a fix on the might of the Russian military machine and exactly how it's unfurling its power is going to be tough. You've reported from the region. Compared to the Gulf War and other highly video rich conflicts, what do you think we're seeing? How much do you think we are truly aware of what's happened in the first 24 hours or so?
Greg, it's always really dangerous to try and ascribe any certainty to what is going on. We obviously have a basic idea of where the Russian strikes have taken place. Now, what the goal of that we're really not certain. There are some tidbits that I think are really interesting that are starting to emerge. And one of those is some of the Russian soldiers that have either been captured or killed, they don't look like they're solely the hardened soldiers who so successfully annexed Crimea or have maybe seen service in Syria. Some of them appear to be in their late teens, early 20s. There are numerous reports on Russian media sites that there are conscripts some of them who've only been in service for a number of months.
So, but fully enlisted, not militia or guerrilla outfits.
Oh, no. These are serving with the Russian army. But the point is that domestically for Vladimir Putin, this could become something that is a bit of a challenge, a significant challenge for the Kremlin, because it's apparent that this isn't going to be like Crimea in 2014 or even Georgia in 2008. There will be Russian losses. There will be loss of life, even though the Russian military right now, it looks like, is doing almost what it wishes in Ukraine. But eventually, when we know more about what Putin's goals are in terms of occupation, is he going to try and control parts of big cities? That's going to require soldiers on the ground to do that, and some of them are going to die. And of course, that will become an issue for Vladimir Putin eventually when he has to try and sell to the Russian population that sacrifice was worth it.
So, Kyle Wilson, before we get to big global strategic considerations, from the sources that you can access as a Russian scholar, what would be your assessment of the operation that the Russian forces are rolling out so far? Would you ascribe the word successful, or what do we know?
Greg, I'm not sure a Russian scholar, as you so kindly characterized me, is well qualified to assess the success of the military operation. I really think that's a bit beyond my pay scale. I would just back up what Allan said there. Fast-moving game. We don't know yet. I have no doubt whatsoever that the crack Russian troops, the Spetsnaz, the equivalent of the SAS have been assigned absolutely crucial roles to engage in sabotage, to secure key objectives like the airports, and presumably to track down and capture the Ukrainian leadership. I've no doubt that will happen. Obviously, our fear is that this will be a bloodbath. Mercy doesn't really figure in the vocabulary of Mr. Putin, and I suspect it's not in the field manuals of the Russian army. So we shall see. Obviously, the degree and efficacy of Ukrainian resistance will be absolutely crucial. And the other point I would make in terms of success would be, I agree with Norman that it's fascinating that we're seeing signs of significant opposition within Russia itself to Putin's gambit. You may recall that about 2 weeks ago, well before the invasion, about 60 quite well-known Russians, actors, journalists, scientists, some of them household names, courageously wrote an open letter strongly opposing, vehemently opposing this move by Putin. We don't know, but it may turn out that this is a false move.
Right, but do you think, Kyle,
Putin.
that those who are appearing publicly at demonstrations are more than what you might describe as the usual suspects, pro-democracy protesters who would show up whenever they could legally get away with it? Is there a movement mobilising at home that that the president should be worried about, Kyle?
Well, again, at this early stage, we're probably generalising and extrapolating too much from our personal experiences. On the night that Putin staged that remarkable theatrical performance with his Security Council, dressing down senior members of it as if they were school children, one of my friends in Russia sent me a text in Russian which translated basically as, our situation is horrific. The clapped-out car of the Russian state is careening downhill at breakneck speed. The driver is drunk and his visor is fogged up.
It's probably one of the clearer assessments we've received so far from any source.
Well, that's the reaction of a Russian friend of mine. I have accumulated a few Russian friends over the years, and I don't know one of them who, number one, would agree that NATO and Ukraine represent a threat to Russia, and number two, would endorse Mr. Putin's policies. But as to the scale and depth or the breadth of opposition to him, too early to say.
All right, let's just hold that thought. We are joined just briefly by the head of mission, the charge d'affaires of the Ukrainian embassy here in Canberra, Vladimir Shalkivsky. Thanks for joining Friday Briefing. We are having a sort of a general discussion here with the analysts, but just wanted to quickly get an assessment from what you're hearing at home. Vladimir Shalkivsky, obviously waking into the second day, from friends, relatives or professional colleagues in the foreign ministry. What's the latest you picked up, particularly on Kiev?
Good day. The messages are diverse. I have my parents who are currently in a bomb shelter in a subway station. I have relatives who are in the front line with weapons in their arms. The situation is grim, but it's important to still, for the government, to have a manageable situation and control it. Of course, there are very scary reports and information that there are sabotage groups already in Kiev, but we have strong morale among our military that are ready to fight and ready to defend our country.
And as far as you know, Vladimir, they're doing that. They're doing that with great force and diligence. What do you understand of the military resistance put up so far by your nation's forces?
Yes, there are obvious examples of their courage and resistance when, for example, in one of the islands in Black Sea, our military were surrendered in Zmyny island, and they were warned by Russians to lay the weapons down, but they refused, and they were killed, terminated by Russians, but they did not give up.
Okay, so that you would see that as encouraging. What about the drive or the advance on the capital? What's your latest there? The Russians seem to have made their way fairly swiftly towards the outskirts of Kiev.
Well, Ukraine is a big country. We do not have such tremendous military resources as Putin have and has, and we were not able to secure all directions and locations. So we defend our territory successfully in some parts, but some parts are already under occupation. And what's going to happen in next 24 or 48 hours, it's really difficult to predict. But for me, the crucial moment is how many people in Ukraine with combat experience will step in, because we have up to 500,000 people with combat experience due to the 8 years of conflict in the East.
And is there a reluctance there? Are they all stepping up?
I cannot say for sure how many of them stepped up, but some of them actually stepped up. And this is the question. How many of them will join our military?
Yep. Well, we are going to check in, I'm sure, with great regularity, Vladimir Shalkivsky, as this unfolds in your country. You have been generous with your time throughout the last 2 weeks and again today. So we'll thank you and let you go back to what I imagine is a very busy occupation as chargé d'affaires at the Ukrainian embassy. Vladimir Shalkivsky joining us from downtown here in Canberra, where the premises are. Allan Behm, let's go back to the international fallout when all of this is over. Let's imagine a scenario in which Putin has prevailed in some fashion. What does it mean for Australia and the West, or even just parking Australia to one side? What will have happened in the global order and the balance of power there?
That's the critical question for Australia, I think. What we've seen so far is Putin playing his top cards, which is an impression of increasing weakness on the part of the United States as a global actor, and more seriously, I think, a very serious erosion in the overall credibility of the United States as the world's hegemon.
Has he diagnosed that correctly? I mean, has he chosen his moment because it wasn't a perception, it was real?
Well, I don't know what he conversed with President Xi about, but I have a suspicion they might have had a talk about that. And whether they've diagnosed it correctly or not, time will only tell. But it seems to be a matter on which they do have a measure of agreement. And if you look at some of the sort of other parameters, and most particularly the current status of NATO itself, there is evidently a fair bit of uncertainty and division within NATO as to what the appropriate course of action might be now. I think Putin will try to exacerbate that. And the implications...
Just break that down, this division. What does that look like and how does he exploit it?
Well, we have the Europeans energy dependent and we have different approaches to what sanctions mean, different approaches to the way in which they're going to look after their long-term energy demands and how they're met from Russia. And I think too, you see Germany and France taking somewhat different approaches to how this might be managed. Macron was very deeply invested. I wonder how he's feeling right at the moment, because he put a big effort into some high energy diplomacy, which for the moment appears not to have worked. Now he's running into an election. I don't know how that's going to work out. The German Chancellor's in a safer position, but he also has taken a somewhat different line. Britain has taken a different line from the Europeans. So in all of that, I think you can see they're not divided and fighting each other, but they're taking not the same position.
Right, there's not the same cohesion.
It's not unity and cohesion. invasion.
Yeah.
And I think that's not such a strong sign for the US.
Kyle Wilson, back to you, just picking up on Alan's point there. I mean, this is not a united front necessarily, even though the differences are subtle there between these Western partners. Does that play in Putin's favour? Do you in fact think that that encouraged him to this point?
Yes, I'm sure that he took a decision that the correlation of forces and global trends were in his interest, because clearly the decision was taken by him to take what may prove a fateful step. As regards NATO, I think it's important. There's 2 points I'd like to offer here. First of all, within Russia itself, opposition to Putin's policies is not confined to the populace. For some weeks now, there have been voices within the elite itself, including the military elite, questioning the notion that NATO represents a threat to Russia, because you'll recall this is absolutely a fundamental doctrine underpinning Putin's policy, his justification for his policy. So, two quite senior military journalists, I mean, Russia has military journalists because it's a militarized country.
Right.
We are not a militarized country. We don't really have military journalists. But two Russian military journalists have said the notion, publicly by the way, the notion that NATO represents a threat to Russia is shameful. It disorients the Russian people and it discredits us. Here is this congeries of this group of 30 divided countries against which we stand. Now, these are senior people. Another very senior commentator, I'm happy to name him, his name is Andrei Kartunov, one of the most authoritative commentators on Russian foreign policy, has said, if NATO represents a threat to Russia, and if membership of NATO represents a threat to Russia, then Russia should be doing all in its power to persuade NATO members to leave, or to dissuade possible new members from joining by offering peace treaties, security guarantees, that is, palpable incentives not to join. So this seems to me to be, quite significant. Now, as regards, again, this justification, in Australia, across the political spectrum, from the right, Alexander Downer, across to the left, series of journalists, you will hear time and again that Russia is a victim. Russia is responding defensively to the threat from NATO, and that Russia has been repeatedly invaded throughout its history. Well, yes, it has. All those invasions, with one exception, the Mongols in the 13th century, have failed.
Right.
And if you look at Russian history, Russia has been the invader a lot more often than it has been invaded.
Yeah, so all of this is suggestive, Norm, of the overreach scenario, or the overreach accusation against Vladimir Putin. That's just possible, but let's flip it around and go the other way. What if this is an outstanding success for him? What could we imagine an emboldened Vladimir Putin might seek to do next? Either close by there in Europe, or even looking further over to his east.
Well, you might want to talk to the leaders of the Baltic states about that, Greg, because they, of course, are very nervously watching what's happening in Ukraine. And, of course, we've seen the United States moving overnight to send more troops to that region to try and reassure its allies. But if you looked elsewhere, aside from Europe, you'd have to look at Central Asia and the former central republics of Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan in that area. Obviously, they were very firmly in the Russian orbit. There have been some overtures by China to exert more influence there. If Vladimir Putin is successful here, as you are hypothesizing, it would be natural to assume that he would try to reassert even more Russian control over some of those republics, perhaps even things like integrating militaries, things of that nature, sort of what has, in de facto terms, happened in Belarus. You could see that happening in Central Asia if this gambit from Vladimir Putin works, of course.
And Allan Behm, that might just entail further meetings and phone calls with one President Xi of China. What's your own assessment of this bond that apparently was re-strengthened over the Winter Olympics there? Is it a block that's emerging, or is it a temporary relationship of convenience?
I'm not even sure that it's reached the status of a temporary relationship of convenience. I think the nature of that dialogue was to Putin's advantage, essentially. All Xi wanted was not to have a war while his Olympics were on, right. And he got that bit. I've looked very carefully at the quality of China's responses so far, and I think they've been very, very constrained. I think the Chinese leadership was taken as much by surprise as anybody else. Because
so some of this analysis that says they're in lockstep here, you think is probably overblown?
Oh, absolutely overblown. Why would China need to be in lockstep on this? Yes, there are some interesting models that might relate to what China could do with respect to Taiwan, but they're
you don't
so
buy it?
different.
You don't think success for Vladimir Putin in Ukraine automatically entices China to do a move on?
Look, nobody in the UN accepts that Ukraine is part of Russia. Everybody in the UN accepts that Taiwan is part of China. So, I mean, there's a fundamental difference at play here. And I don't think that the modelling that one puts around Putin's actions plays well at all for China's putative steps with respect to Taiwan.
Yeah, Kyle Wilson, probably slightly outside your area of interest, but any observations you'd make about that? I mean, so much has been written and analysed about China-Russia in recent weeks. Is it a bond that's been forged there?
Well, actually, Greg, it's not outside my sphere of interest because I spent 5 years living and working in China, trying to learn Mandarin with mixed success, and I spent another 5 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs as the head of the China political section. So I spent 10 years working on and with the Chinese, and so I've also looked at this relationship fairly closely. Obviously, it's a complex relationship, and we've got to be fairly careful about just how we characterise it. How close is it? How cohesive is it? How long might it last? And I don't want to be facile or glib about this, but one of the most famous statements ever made in the history of Australia's relations with Russia was made by the deputy head of mission of the Soviet embassy, Mr. Yevgeny Rogov, in 1982. And he said at a DFAT lunch, "One day we will get back into bed with the Chinese and then we will screw you from both ends."
All right. I'm glad you slipped that in because we had time running away from us. Kyle Wilson, Norman Hammond and Allan Behm. Going to have to wrap up and thank you all on that note. Goodbye from us.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.